Hello, and welcome to another issue of Julia Herdman History with me, Julia Herdman. Today, I am critically examining a particular aspect of the French Revolution, women's rights and liberties. The French Revolution was one of the most pivotal events in modern history, but it was not a single event. Rather, it was a series of sometimes dramatic and often violent events that began in 1789 and lasted 10 years. Ultimately, it led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and plunged Europe into 20 years of war. The revolution was renowned for its three guiding ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity. These three ideals set a precedent for modern political thought. Today, we see them in many of the declarations of bodies such as the United Nations and the World Health Organization. This is because the revolution was primarily about freedom from oppressive governments and the citizens' right to participate in creating the laws that govern them. These concepts were enshrined in Article 4 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1792. In its preamble and 17 articles, it sets out the natural and inalienable rights of the citizen, including freedom, ownership, security, and resistance to oppression. It recognizes equality before the law and the justice system and affirms the principle of the separation of the powers of the state. Liberty was defined as being able to do anything that does not harm others. This definition was designed to dismantle the absolute power of the monarchy and the French Catholic Church. However, the concept of liberty was complex and multifaceted when applied to women. While the revolution championed the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, women's experiences and roles within the framework created by their supposed liberators were often contradictory and fraught with challenges. In the beginning, revolutionary rhetoric inspired many women to demand greater rights and participate actively in political debates. Influential figures like Olympe de Gouges and Pauline Léon emerged, advocating for women's rights and equality. Between 1789 and 1793, women achieved some important gains. The revolutionary legislators gave them an actual civil existence, civil rights for the first time in French history. They were given their own legal personality separate from their fathers, brothers, sons and husbands. In short, women were no longer eternal children in the eyes of the law. As a sign of this evolution, in August 1790, family courts became the only body able to settle family disputes and conflicts. Most importantly, especially for wealthy women, the ability of a greedy husband to lock up his wife or even his children in a prison-like institution disappeared. Revolutionary marriage reforms profoundly changed the relationship between men and women. The introduction of the civil marriage offered many women a simple contract recognized as legitimate compared to the vagaries of the existing religious marriage. But, in doing so, the revolutionaries broke the traditional vision of a marriage that no one could dissolve. And so, the possibility of divorce, including by mutual consent, became a possibility for unhappy couples. To add to this new marital equality, the National Assembly proclaimed that a married couple had equal rights under the law, even in the event of their separation. The aim was to ensure civil protection for women, encourage remarriage, and the birth of more children. After the marriage reform came reforms to inheritance laws. In April 1791, a new law established equal rights to inheritance for both girls and boys. So, the condition of women between 1789 and 1793 improved. These gains and improvements were short-lived. Everything began to change in 1793. This annus horribilis began with the execution of King Louis XVI. On January 21, King Louis was executed by guillotine for treason against the people of France, stirring up royalist support in France and political opposition from the leaders of Europe's monarchies. The Reign of Terror began. Political purges, mass executions, and other repressive measures became the norm. Led by the Committee of Public Safety, headed by Maximilien Robespierre, the government sought to consolidate power and defend the revolution from internal and external threats. In February, the National Convention declared war on Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, further escalating the existing conflicts France was engaged in across Europe. In the summer, there was a royalist uprising in the Vendée region. This royalist and Catholic uprising was brutally suppressed by revolutionary forces, leaving thousands dead and injured. In addition to the revolutionary government's political problems, by the onset of autumn, severe food shortages and inflation were causing social unrest and discontent among the populace across the country. The government's response was strict measures, including price controls and rationing. At the same time, they ploughed on with the implementation of radical policies, such as the establishment of the revolutionary calendar and the de-Christianization of the country. The new government's attitude to women and women's rights also changed. The early, radical phase of the revolution witnessed the rise of women's clubs and societies, such as the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, which campaigned for economic and political reforms. In the early and optimistic days of the revolution, the notion of equality was applied in theory to women and to the enslaved people in the French colonial territories. However, as the struggle between the three main classes of nobility, clergy and bourgeoisie dragged on without resolution, many initial proposals for universal liberation began to slip away. In the French territory of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, Toussaint Louverture led a successful independence movement by enslaved and free people of color. But, by October 1793, the National Convention had banned all women's clubs, effectively silencing organized female political activism. On November 3, 1793, Olympe de Gouges, the author of the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, was executed for her opposition to the revolutionary government and her advocacy for women's rights. From this point on, female citizens were denied the right to bear arms, join the National Guard, and vote. Other notable women who met their death at the guillotine include Charlotte Corday, who was tried and executed on July 17, 1793. She assassinated the radical Jacobin leader Jean-Paul Marat, hoping his death would halt the violence and save the Republic from further bloodshed. Madame Roland, a key figure in the Girondin faction who campaigned for a constitutional monarchy much like that of Great Britain, was another prominent victim. She was executed on November 8, 1793. Roland used her influence and writings to support democratic ideals and oppose the radical Jacobins, but her political stance eventually led to her downfall. The Martyrs of Compiègne, a group of 16 Carmelite nuns, were executed on July 17, 1794. Thousands of Christians were killed by the guillotine, as well as by mass deportations, drownings, imprisonments, shootings, mob violence, and sheer butchery. In 1790, the French revolutionary government passed the civil constitution of the clergy, which outlawed religious life. The women were charged with maintaining their religious practices, which was seen as counter-revolutionary. Their execution is often noted for its brutality and the nuns' display of faith and courage. These women, among many others, highlight the extreme measures taken during the Reign of Terror, which ran to July 1794, ending with the execution of Robespierre himself. However, the end of the Terror did not stop legislators from undoing earlier reforms and establishing the preeminence of a strictly male political body. Women's political and legal status was downgraded. While it was acknowledged that women had an autonomous civil existence, they were to have no political rights. And so, after 1793, women were to be citizens without citizenship. When the French Revolution started in 1789, most women were restricted to their homes. They were expected to focus on domestic duties and family responsibilities, while public life was reserved for men. But the revolutionary ideas of equality and comradeship inspired women from all walks of life, from the lowest fishwife to the daughters of notables. They were eager to express their political views and concerns. Upper-class, intellectual women discussed property rights and the right to vote, while working-class women marched through the streets, demanding the right to be paid for domestic work and affordable bread. The women of Paris were deeply involved in the French Revolution. Like their male compatriots, their political beliefs varied widely, reflecting their positions in society. Wealthy women from the aristocratic and the bourgeoisie were salonnières, and they hosted intellectual gatherings or parties for their husbands and lovers. Many Parisian women were concerned with economic conditions and high grain prices, while their neighbors might be demanding institutional reforms, such as the right for women to establish their own political clubs. Salonnières had the time and resources to write, so historians have often focused on these femmes célèbres. These women could afford to commission portraits, a luxury not available to the lower classes. As a result, many Salonnière writings have been digitized for remote access. On the other hand, radical revolutionary women are known mainly through the narratives of others. One of the most influential women of the Revolution was Sophie de Condorcet. Sophie collaborated with her husband, the Marquis de Condorcet, to advocate for full women's suffrage in July 1790 in a document titled in English, On the Admission of Women to Civil Rights. Madame de Condorcet, who was born Sophie de Grouchy, was a significant figure in the intellectual and political landscape of the French Revolution. She was not only a Salonnière but also a profound thinker who critically engaged with contemporary philosophical works. De Condorcet believed that recognizing mutual dependence among people is essential for fostering social equality and practical cooperation. Her writings emphasized that inequality impedes the growth of sympathy and, consequently, the potential for societal harmony. Sophie de Condorcet's intellectual pursuits extended beyond philosophy into practical political advocacy. She worked closely with her husband, the Marquis de Condorcet, championing women's suffrage and broader social reforms. Her ability to translate and critically engage with prominent works of her time highlights her role as a leading feminist and intellectual of the French Revolution. Equally influential in the upper echelons was Salonnière Germaine de Stael. As the daughter of the famous and beloved finance minister, Jacques Necker, de Stael enjoyed a privileged position in society, which she used to advocate for the rights of others. She was admired by the great thinkers of her day for her charisma and brilliance. Her salon attracted many foreign dignitaries and regularly brought together liberals, nobles, wives, and mistresses. Small dinners at her Hôtel on the Rive Gauche included notable figures like Thomas Jefferson, Lafayette, Thomas Paine, and Gouverneur Morris, the American envoy to Paris. The conversations at these soirées on the fashionable Rue de Bac influenced popular sentiment and shifted political opinion. De Stael herself was a centrist politically. However, having grown up listening to such luminaries as Diderot and Voltaire verbally spar in her mother's salons, she had developed an ability to challenge and sometimes confound men of any political persuasion. Although de Stael had grown up in a conservative home, her intellectual curiosity made her question these conventions. Even before she was 22, she had already published a well-received book on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The philosopher Rousseau was one of the leading intellectual architects of the Revolution, particularly his most famous books, The Social Contract and Émile, otherwise known as On Education. In these publications, Rousseau laid the groundwork for revolutionary ideas about democracy and education. In The Social Contract, he argued for the people's sovereignty and the importance of collective decision-making. However, Rousseau's views on women were decidedly conservative. In Émile, he argued that women should be educated primarily to please and serve men, asserting their natural roles as wives and mothers. He believed that men and women had inherently different natures and should be educated differently to fulfill their respective roles in society. Stael appreciated Rousseau's exploration of human emotions and his critique of societal corruption. However, she was critical of his views on women, particularly his ideas on their education and societal roles, as articulated in Émile. Stael found Rousseau's perception of women limiting, and she believed it contradicted the principles of freedom and equality he championed for men. Regarding women's rights, Madame de Stael was a progressive thinker. While she did not actively campaign for women's direct political participation, she strongly advocated for equal civil rights, including freedom of speech, religion, and assembly. Stael believed these freedoms were essential for both men and women and crucial for achieving a just society. Her views were significantly ahead of her time, as she argued for intellectual and moral equality between the sexes, challenging the prevailing norms that confined women to domestic roles. Perhaps the most intriguing female revolutionary organizer was Théophile de Méricourt. Her name may look aristocratic, but de Méricourt refers to the small town of Marcourt, where she was born. Théophile was a prosperous peasant inspired by the ideals of the Revolution who found herself in Paris just before the fall of the Bastille. Having had numerous lovers and suffered the death of a child, she felt compelled to fight for the downtrodden. She wore a blood-red or white riding outfit and carried a sabre. She was as comfortable at the tribune or speaker's podium in the National Assembly as she was bantering with the fishwives of Les Halles. Although she was popular in the clubs, her unorthodox approach to life did not fit comfortably in the context of Parisian politics. She was ruthlessly disparaged as a patriot's whore by the royalist press. Théophile, like de Gouges, was slandered, abused and misrepresented. Unlike de Gouges, de Méricourt survived the revolution, but with no family to support her, she ended her days in the madhouse. During the French Revolution, working-class women played crucial roles that significantly influenced the course of events. These women, often called the sans-culottes, were deeply involved in political activism and street demonstrations. The sans-culottes were the men and women who made up the urban poor. They were laborers, artisans, shopkeepers, or the wives, mothers and sisters of such men. They wanted to abolish aristocratic privileges, ensure access to essential goods like bread, and establish a direct democracy. One of the most notable events involving working-class women was the Women's March on Versailles on October 5, 1789. Thousands of Parisian women, including market traders and fishwives, marched to the royal palace in Versailles to demand bread and political reforms. The shortages of food and the consequent high prices were a significant problem for the authorities and a constant source of worry for women throughout the revolutionary decade. Working-class women also formed political clubs and organizations to advocate for their rights and influence revolutionary policies. The Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, founded by Claire Lacombe and Pauline Léon in 1793, was one such group that pushed for gender equality and better economic conditions. They faced significant resistance from male revolutionaries and conservative women, leading to the dissolution of their society and a ban on women's clubs in October 1793. Claire Lacombe, originally an actress, became a revolutionary icon known for her bravery during the storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10, 1792. In March 1791, she presented a petition to the Legislative Assembly calling for creating an all-female militia, which was an amazingly radical idea at the time. She was deeply involved in revolutionary activities and was known for her bold stance on women's right to bear arms and full citizenship. Despite the society's dissolution in October 1793, Léon remained influential, though she faced arrest and persecution for her activism. The trouble was that the revolutionary government, particularly the Jacobins, perceived these women's clubs as a threat. What did women get out of the revolution they helped to bring about? During the French Revolution, some women were allowed to vote in the 1789 provincial assemblies, but these were primarily married women and widows who owned property. Their voting rights were based on property ownership, not their sex, and were limited to provincial elections. Women were not allowed to hold public offices. Indeed, there was not a single woman among the 1,150 deputies called to the Estates General in 1789. Women's right to vote in national elections was withdrawn in 1793 and was not reinstated until 1943. Another glaring example of the revolution's failure to protect women's rights was the setting of the age of consent for girls at a shockingly low age of 11 years, in 1791. It was 14 for boys. This decision reflects a broader societal view at the time that children were miniature adults capable of making decisions beyond their years. It also exposes a troubling lack of empathy and protection for young girls, leaving girls vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, and undermining the revolution's claim to promote human dignity and freedom. The treatment of young girls, even those from the most privileged backgrounds, during this period was harsh. Many were forced into marriages, often arranged without their consent, that prioritized family alliances and the family's economic concerns. The poor, of course, were freer to choose who they married, but a girl born into an established or aspiring family usually had no choice about who they married. These practices starkly contrasted with the revolutionary rhetoric of individual rights and freedom, revealing deep-seated gender inequalities. Under the Code Napoleon of 1804, male dominance of the political sphere was enshrined in law, and women's voices were finally removed from the public sphere. Men were granted considerable authority over their families, and women were deprived of many individual rights. Married women were legally considered minors and were placed under the guardianship of their husbands, who controlled all family property and finances. Women could not independently engage in legal contracts, sue in court, or administer property without their husband's consent. The code also reintroduced the notion of dowries and made it difficult for women to initiate divorce. The women of France played a vital role in enabling the revolution, which in 1789 proclaimed universal rights and freedoms. For a few short years, they benefited from advancements, such as the legalization of divorce and the establishment of civil marriage, but women were largely excluded from political power. Female activists like Olympe de Gouges and groups like the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women pushed for gender equality but faced severe repression. In 1793, women's clubs were banned, and many female leaders were arrested or silenced. Thus, the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality were not fully extended to women, leading many to argue that women were indeed betrayed by the male revolutionaries who prioritized male political and social dominance. As far as the right to an education is concerned, girls in France had to wait until the early 1880s when mandatory and secular education for both boys and girls was introduced. Before that, educational opportunities for girls were provided mainly by religious institutions. The women of France had to wait until 1943 to get the vote, and no-fault divorce only became a possibility after 1975. On that sad note, if you have enjoyed discovering this corner of history, don't forget to press the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode of Julia Herdman History. So, goodbye for now, and thank you for your support. Until then, stay safe.